happened on a quiet street in Frankfurt, Kentucky on May 3, 1992, wasn't just another statistic. It was the kind of disappearance that defies logic, that breaks every rule of how these cases usually unfold, and that leaves investigators with more questions than answers 3 decades later. A 3-year-old girl vanished from her own front porch in broad daylight in less than 10 minutes, without a single scream, without a single witness, and without a single trace. If you believe that every missing child deserves to have their story told, that every family deserves answers, and that cold cases should never be forgotten, I need you to do something right now. Hit that like button, drop a comment below, and smash that subscribe button. Turn on those notifications, because the only way these cases get solved is if people like you refuse to let them fade into obscurity. Your engagement, your shares, your comments could be the difference between a case staying cold forever and a breakthrough that finally brings a family the closure they've been desperately seeking for decades. Now, let's dive into one of Kentucky's most baffling unsolved mysteries. What happened on a quiet street in Frankfurt, Kentucky on May 3, 1992, wasn't just another statistic in the grim catalog of missing children cases that fill law enforcement databases across America. It wasn't just another Amber Alert, another press conference with tearful parents, another search party combing through woods and fields. It was the kind of disappearance that defies logic, that breaks every rule of how these cases usually unfold, that leaves seasoned investigators shaking their heads in disbelief 3 decades later. It was the kind of case that changes a community forever, that draws a line between before and after, that makes people lock their doors and watch their children with a paranoia that never quite fades. This is the story of Angelica Lewis, and this is the Untold Crime Cases. Some spring afternoons burn themselves into a town's memory forever, not because of sunshine or the sweet smell of fresh-cut grass drifting through open windows, not because of children's laughter echoing down tree-lined streets or the gentle sound of wind chimes singing in the breeze, not because of baseball games in backyard or lemonade stands on street corners or the simple joy of a perfect day, but because of the moment everything changed, because of the moment when normal became nightmare, because of the moment when safe became something that could never be taken for granted again, because of the moment when every parent's worst fear stopped being an abstract possibility and became a concrete reality that happened right here, right now, to people just like us. Frankfurt, Kentucky, May 3, 1992. A Sunday afternoon that started like 10,000 other Sunday afternoons in small-town America and ended with a mystery that still keeps investigators awake at night. It was the kind of day when honeysuckle hung heavy in the humid air, when the temperature hovered in the mid-70s, when every window on every street stood open to catch whatever breeze might wander through. The kind of day when mothers hung laundry on clotheslines, white sheets billowing like sails in the gentle wind. The kind of day when fathers washed cars in driveways, radio playing classic rock while soap suds ran down into storm drains. The kind of day when children rode bicycles in endless circles around cul-de-sacs, training wheels clicking on pavement, handlebar streamers flying. The kind of day that felt safe, that felt normal, that felt like every other spring Sunday in the America we like to remember, the America of unlocked doors and borrowed cups of sugar, and everyone knowing everyone else's name. Frankfurt wasn't the kind of place where bad things happened. Population barely cracking 10,000 souls, it was the quintessential American small town, the kind of place that time seemed to have left pleasantly untouched by the problems plaguing bigger cities. It was the kind of town where people still left their doors unlocked, where neighbors knew not just each other's names, but each other's business, their kids' names, their dogs' names, what time they left for work, and what time they came home. The kind of town where the biggest crimes were usually teenagers spray painting the water tower or someone's dog getting into someone else's garbage, or maybe, on a really wild Friday night, a domestic disturbance call that ended with everyone shaking hands and promising to keep the volume down. It was the kind of place people moved to specifically because they wanted to raise their children somewhere safe, somewhere wholesome, somewhere that felt like stepping back in time to a simpler America. An America that maybe never really existed, except in our collective imagination, but an America people desperately wanted to believe in, wanted to build, wanted to give their children. Frankfurt was that place. Frankfurt was the American dream in its most modest, most attainable, most real form. The town sat in Franklin County, in the heart of Kentucky bluegrass country, surrounded by rolling hills and horse farms and bourbon distilleries. The state capital, also Frankfurt, was just down the road. But this Frankfurt felt worlds away from politics and government buildings and all that official business. This was a working-class town, a town of families who got up early and worked hard and came home tired, but satisfied. A town of Little League baseball and church on Sunday and Friday night football games, where it seemed like the entire population turned out to cheer for the high school team. Downtown consisted of maybe 6 blocks of brick buildings from the 1920s and 30s, antique shops and a hardware store, and a diner where the same waitress had been pouring coffee for 20 years and knew everyone's usual order. There was a library, small but well-loved, where mothers brought their children for story time every Thursday morning. There was a park with swings and a merry-go-round, and a pavilion where the town held summer concerts and 4th of July barbecues. There was a grocery store, a gas station, a post office, where people still stopped to chat while buying stamps. It was the kind of town where nothing happened. Until the day everything happened. Riverview Lane sat on the eastern edge of town, a modest street of small single-family homes built mostly in the 1960s and 70s during the post-war housing boom that transformed America's landscape. Nothing fancy, nothing that would catch your eye if you drove past. Just working-class homes with tidy yards, chain-link fences, basketball hoops mounted over garage doors, and big wheels scattered across driveways, swing sets in backyards, gardens growing tomatoes and cucumbers and green beans, cars parked in driveways, most of them older models but clean and cared for. The kind of street where everyone worked hard, where most families had 2 cars that had seen better days but still ran just fine, thank you very much. Where people took pride in their homes, even if those homes would never make the cover of Better Homes and Gardens or Southern Living. Where lawns were mowed every Saturday morning like clockwork, where flower beds were weeded, where Christmas lights went up the day after Thanksgiving and came down promptly on New Year's Day. Where people knew their neighbors, waved to each other from porches, borrowed tools, and returned them promptly, watched each other's houses when someone went on vacation. The street itself ran roughly east to west, maybe a quarter-mile long, connecting 2 larger roads that led toward downtown on one end and toward the highway on the other. Maybe 20 houses total, 10 on each side, with mature oak and maple trees lining both sides of the street, their branches forming a green canopy overhead in summer. The kind of trees that had been planted when the neighborhood was built, that had grown along with the families who lived there, that dropped acorns on roofs in autumn and provided shade for children playing in yards. There were no sidewalks, just the street itself and patches of grass between the road and the properties. People walked their dogs down the middle of the street without worrying about traffic because everyone who drove down Riverview Lane lived there and knew to watch for kids and pets. The speed limit was 25 miles per hour, and everyone actually observed it because these were their children playing in these yards, their neighbors walking these dogs, their community to protect and preserve. The Lewis family lived in a small blue house at 1721 Riverview Lane, 3rd from the corner on the south side of the street. It was a compact ranch-style home, maybe 1,200 square feet, with white trim around the windows and a small covered front porch that couldn't have been more than 6 feet deep and 12 feet wide. Just big enough for a couple of chairs and maybe a small table. The kind of porch where you might sit on a summer evening with a glass of iced tea and wave to neighbors passing by. The house had been built in 1967, solid construction with good bones, as people like to say. Nothing fancy but well-maintained. Blue vinyl siding, probably put on sometime in the 80s to cover the original wood. White aluminum trim around the windows. A simple concrete walkway leading from the driveway to the front porch steps, maybe 3 steps up to the porch itself. The kind of house you could find in any working-class neighborhood in any small town in America. A chain-link fence surrounded the backyard, about 4 feet high, the standard height for keeping dogs in and giving children a safe place to play. The grass was freshly mowed, neat diagonal lines still visible from where Michael Lewis had pushed the mower back and forth the day before. Saturday being lawn mowing day in the Lewis household, just like it was in most households on Riverview Lane. A small garden grew along the side of the house, between the Lewis property and their neighbors to the east. Tomatoes on stakes, pepper plants, maybe some green beans. The kind of garden that provided fresh vegetables for summer dinners and made you feel connected to the earth, to the seasons, to something real and tangible in an increasingly complicated world. Everything about the house said normal. Everything about it said safe. Everything about it said, this is where nothing bad happens. This is where families grow. This is where children are raised and memories are made, and life unfolds in its most ordinary, most beautiful, most precious way. Carol Lewis was 28 years old that spring, a stay-at-home mother who had put her career as a dental hygienist on hold to raise her daughter. She'd worked for 3 years at a dentist's office in downtown Frankfurt before Angelica was born. Liked the work, liked the people, liked feeling useful and productive. But when she got pregnant, she and Michael had talked about it and decided that if they could afford it, if they could make it work on one income, she'd stay home for at least the first few years. They wanted to be the kind of parents who were there, who didn't miss the first word or the first step, or any of those precious moments that disappear so quickly. Money was tight sometimes, tighter than it had been when they both worked, but they managed. They didn't take vacations. They bought clothes at discount stores. They clipped coupons and watched sales and made do. But they felt good about their choice. They felt like they were doing the right thing for their daughter, giving her the kind of childhood they'd both had. The kind where mom was there when you got home from school, where dinner was on the table at 6 o'clock every night, where bedtime stories were read and prayers were said, and someone was always there. Carol was petite, maybe 5'3", with light brown hair she usually wore pulled back in a ponytail. She had the kind of face people called sweet, soft features, and kind eyes, and a smile that made people feel comfortable. She was the kind of person who remembered birthdays, who brought casseroles when neighbors were sick, who organized the neighborhood watch program and the annual block party. The kind of person everyone liked, everyone trusted, everyone knew they could count on. Her husband, Michael, was 31, working as a shift supervisor at the paper mill 15 miles outside of town, on the road that led toward Lexington. It was decent work, steady work, union job with benefits and a pension. He'd started there right out of high school, worked his way up from the floor to a supervisory position. It meant long hours sometimes, meant coming home tired and dirty, meant the smell of chemicals and wood pulp that never quite washed out of his work clothes. But it paid the bills, put food on the table, kept the mortgage current. Michael was tall, maybe 6'1", broad-shouldered from physical work, dark hair starting to thin a little at the crown, his father's build, his mother's eyes. He was quiet, not unfriendly, but not the type to strike up conversations with strangers. He worked hard, came home, played with his daughter, helped his wife with dishes, watched the news, and went to bed. On weekends, he mowed the lawn, worked on the car, fixed things around the house. He coached Little League in the summers, even though Angelica was still too young to play. He went to church most Sundays. He was, by every measure, a good man. A solid man. The kind of man who did what he said he would do, who kept his promises, who took care of his family. They'd been married for 6 years, high school sweethearts who'd done everything by the book. Met in 10th grade when they ended up in the same geometry class. Started dating junior year. Went to prom together, him in a rented tux that was a little too big, her in a pink dress her mother had made. Graduated together in 1983. While other couples their age were breaking up and getting back together and breaking up again, they just stayed together. Simple as that. They loved each other. They wanted the same things. Why make it more complicated than it needed to be? They waited until marriage, the way they'd been raised to do, the way that seemed right to both of them. Got married in August of 1986 at the First Baptist Church on Main Street. Small ceremony with family and close friends. Reception in the church basement with cake and punch and a radio playing instead of a DJ because that's what they could afford. Honeymoon was a weekend in Louisville, 2 nights in a hotel that seemed fancy to them, dinner at nice restaurants, walking around downtown holding hands, and feeling very adult, very married, very ready to start their life together. They lived in an apartment for the first 2 years, saving every penny they could for a down payment on a house. Carol worked full-time at the dental office. Michael worked at the mill and picked up overtime whenever he could. They didn't go out much, didn't spend money on entertainment or clothes or anything that wasn't essential. They had a goal, and they were determined to reach it. In 1988, they bought the house on Riverview Lane. It needed work, needed paint, and new carpet, and the kitchen cabinets were ancient, but it was theirs. They could make the payments. They had a yard. They had a neighborhood perfect for raising children. They had everything they needed. And then in February of 1989, on Valentine's Day of all days, Carol gave birth to a daughter they named Angelica Marie Lewis. 7 pounds, 3 ounces, 20 inches long, dark curly hair, and her father's brown eyes, and lungs that worked just fine, announcing her arrival to the world with a healthy, indignant wail. They weren't wealthy, but they were comfortable. They were happy. They were living the American dream in its most modest, most attainable form. The dream that says, if you work hard and make good choices and treat people right, you can have a good life. You can have a home and a family and enough. Not everything, maybe, but enough. More than enough, really, when you stop to think about what really mattered. And then there was Angelica, 3 years old that spring of 1992. Born February 14th, 1989, a Valentine's Day baby. Her parents joked that she was their little Valentine, the greatest gift either of them had ever received. She had dark curly hair that her mother kept in 2 ponytails, one on each side of her head, secured with bright pink ribbons that matched her favorite pink dress. The kind of curls that bounced when she ran, that caught the light in the sun, that made strangers stop Carol in the grocery store to say what beautiful hair your daughter has. She had her father's brown eyes, deep and expressive, the kind of eyes that showed every emotion. When she was happy, they sparkled. When she was sad, they filled with tears that broke her parents' hearts. When she was concentrating on something, her tongue poking out between her teeth as she worked on a puzzle or tried to tie her shoes, those eyes would narrow in fierce determination. Michael loved to watch her face when she was thinking, loved seeing himself reflected in those eyes, loved knowing that some part of him would live on in this perfect little person. and she had her mother's smile, that gap-toothed grin that made everyone who saw it smile back. The two front teeth on top were coming in, but there was still a gap between them, the kind of gap that made her whistle a little when she talked, that made her even more endearing somehow. When she smiled, really smiled, her whole face lit up. Her eyes, crinkled at the corners, her cheeks bunched up, her nose scrunched. It was impossible not to smile back, impossible not to feel happy in the presence of that much pure, uncomplicated joy. She was small for her age, maybe 30 inches tall, weighing somewhere around 28 pounds. The pediatrician said she was healthy, just petite, probably going to take after her mother's side of the family. She'd been in the 25th percentile for height and weight at her last checkup. Nothing to worry about, just a small child, a delicate child. A child who still looked more like a toddler than a preschooler, still had that baby face, those chubby hands, that way of walking that wasn't quite steady yet. She had a tiny birthmark on her left shoulder blade, shaped vaguely like a crescent moon. It was small, maybe the size of a dime, a little darker than the rest of her skin. Carol had worried about it when Angelica was first born, had asked the pediatrician if it was something to be concerned about. The doctor had reassured her it was just a birthmark. Nothing dangerous, nothing that would cause problems. Michael said it was their daughter's special mark, the thing that made her unique, the way they'd always be able to identify her even in a crowd of children. He had no idea how prophetic those words would become. She loved Sesame Street, especially Big Bird. Every morning at 9 o'clock, Carol would turn on PBS, and Angelica would plant herself in front of the television, clutching Hoppy, her stuffed bunny, and watch with complete absorption. She knew all the characters, would talk to the TV, would sing along with the songs. Big Bird was her favorite. Something about that tall yellow bird with the childlike voice just resonated with her. She had a Big Bird nightlight in her bedroom, a Big Bird poster on the wall. For her 3rd birthday, Carol had made her a Big Bird cake, yellow frosting and candy eyes, and Angelica had been so excited she could barely blow out the candles. She loved peanut butter sandwiches, but only if they were cut into triangles with the crusts removed. Carol had tried cutting them into squares once, tried leaving the crusts on another time, and both experiments had ended, with Angelica refusing to eat, tears streaming down her face. She wasn't being difficult, Carol realized. She just liked what she liked. She found comfort in things being the way she expected them to be. So Carol cut the sandwiches into triangles and carefully removed every bit of crust, and Angelica would eat happily, getting peanut butter on her face and her hands, and sometimes in her hair. She loved her stuffed bunny, a worn gray rabbit named Hoppy that she'd had since she was 6 months old. It had been a gift from Michael's mother. Bought at a drugstore probably, nothing expensive or special. But to Angelica, it was everything. Hoppy went everywhere with her. Hoppy slept in her bed every night, tucked under her arm. Hoppy sat at the table during meals, in his own chair. Hoppy got Band-Aids when Angelica scraped her knee, got put to bed when Angelica took a nap, got fed invisible food when Angelica played kitchen. The fur was rubbed nearly bald in places from constant hugging, from being carried everywhere, from being loved so thoroughly and completely that the stuffing was starting to shift, and one ear was coming loose, and the plastic eyes were scratched and dull. Carol had offered to buy Angelica a new stuffed animal, something nicer, something that wasn't falling apart. But Angelica had looked at her with those big brown eyes and said no. She wanted Hoppy. Hoppy was her friend. You don't replace your friends just because they get old. And Carol had felt her heart swell with love for this empathetic little person who already understood loyalty and friendship in a way some adults never learned. She was 3 years old, just 3 years old, Still in that magical age where everything is new and exciting and possible. Still young enough to believe in Santa Claus and the Tooth Fairy and monsters under the bed that Daddy had to check for every night. Still young enough to think her parents could fix anything, solve any problem, protect her from any harm. Still young enough to feel completely, absolutely safe in her small blue house on Riverview Lane in Frankfurt, Kentucky. She was someone's entire world. She was the reason Carol got up in the morning, the reason Michael went to work every day, the reason they'd bought this house and planted this garden and planned for the future. She was every hope and every dream and every prayer they'd ever had, distilled into 3 feet of curly-haired, gap-toothed, big bird-loving perfection. And in less than 10 minutes on a sunny Sunday afternoon, she disappeared without a trace. The day had started like any other Sunday in the Lewis household. Michael's alarm went off at 7 o'clock, even though he didn't have to work. Years of waking up early for his shift at the mill had trained his body to wake at 7, regardless of whether it was a workday or not. He lay in bed for a few minutes, listening to Carol's soft breathing beside him, listening to the birds chirping outside the window, enjoying those peaceful moments before the day really began. He got up quietly, trying not to wake Carol, padded to the bathroom in his bare feet, splashed water on his face, ran his fingers through his hair, studied his reflection in the mirror with the critical eye of a man approaching middle age. A few gray hairs starting to show at his temples, lines around his eyes that hadn't been there 5 years ago. He wasn't old, not yet, but he wasn't young anymore either. He thought about his father, wondered if he was starting to look like him, wondered if Angelica would remember him this way when she was grown. He went to check on Angelica, the way he did every morning, easing her bedroom door open and peeking inside. She was still asleep, sprawled across her toddler bed, with Hoppy clutched in one arm and the blanket kicked off onto the floor. She always kicked off her blankets in the night. Carol would cover her up before going to bed, and by morning, the blankets would be on the floor, and Angelica would be sleeping in just her pajamas. She must run hot, Michael thought. Takes after her mother that way. He stood in the doorway for a minute, just watching her sleep, her chest rising and falling, her curls spread across the pillow, her face peaceful and innocent and perfect. He felt that rush of love that still surprised him sometimes with its intensity. This was his daughter. This perfect little person was his. He'd helped create her, and now he got to watch her grow, got to be part of her life, got to protect her and teach her, and hopefully give her a good childhood, a happy childhood, the kind of childhood she'd remember fondly when she was grown. He pulled the door mostly closed, leaving it open just a crack, the way Angelica liked it. She didn't like the dark, didn't like having the door closed all the way. She needed to know that her parents were there, that she could call out and they'd come, that she wasn't alone. In the kitchen, Michael started a pot of coffee, the old percolator burbling and filling the house with that rich smell that meant morning, that meant Sunday, that meant a day off with his family. He scrambled some eggs, made toast, set the table for 3, even though he knew Angelica wouldn't wake for at least another hour. The routine soothed him, the simple domestic tasks that marked the rhythm of his life. Carol woke around 8, drawn by the smell of coffee and the sound of Michael moving around in the kitchen. She came out in her robe and slippers, hair messy from sleep, and Michael thought she looked beautiful. After 6 years of marriage, he still thought she was beautiful, especially like this. First thing in the morning before she'd put on makeup or fixed her hair, when she was just Carol, his wife, his partner in this life they'd built together. They ate breakfast together, talking quietly about nothing important. The weather, what needed to be done around the house, whether they should go to church later or skip this week. They'd been meaning to go more regularly, felt guilty sometimes that they weren't setting a better example for Angelica. But life got busy, and Sunday morning was the only time all week they got to sleep in a little, to have a slow morning together as a family. Angelica woke around 9, calling for her mother the way she did every morning. Not crying, just calling. Mommy, Mommy, Mommy. That little voice carrying down the hallway. Carol went to get her, helped her use the bathroom, changed her out of her pajamas and into play clothes. Pink leggings and a white t-shirt with a rainbow on the front. The pink ribbons in her hair to keep the curls out of her face. They had breakfast together, Angelica in her booster seat at the table, Hoppy sitting in the chair next to her. Carol made Angelica scrambled eggs and toast, cut into triangles because that's how she liked it. Angelica ate slowly, talking to Hoppy between bites, telling him about her dreams, even though no one had asked, and her dreams didn't make much sense anyway, the way children's dreams never do. Something about swimming and ice cream and a big dog. Michael and Carol smiled at each other over their coffee cups, sharing that moment of parental amusement and love. After breakfast, Angelica watched Sesame Street while Carol did dishes and Michael read the newspaper. This was their Sunday morning routine, comfortable and familiar. Nothing special, nothing remarkable. Just a family being a family, living their life, not knowing that everything was about to change forever. Around 10:30, Michael said he needed to run to the hardware store. There was a leaky faucet in the bathroom he'd been meaning to fix, and he wanted to get the parts before the store closed at noon on Sunday. Carol said fine. She'd probably take Angelica outside for a while, let her play in the yard. It was such a beautiful day. Seemed a shame to waste it inside. Michael kissed Carol, kissed Angelica, told them he'd be back in 30 minutes or so. He got in his truck, a Ford F-150 that had seen better days, but still ran fine, and headed toward downtown. Carol cleaned up from breakfast, wiped down the kitchen counters, started a load of laundry. She could see Angelica in the living room through the doorway, still watching TV, Hoppy in her lap. Just a normal morning. Just normal. Around 11 o'clock, Carol decided it was time to go outside. The weather was too perfect to stay inside all day. She turned off the TV, much to Angelica's disappointment, and said, "Come on, sweetie, let's go play outside." Angelica wanted to bring Hoppy, but Carol said no. "Leave Hoppy inside. We don't want him to get dirty." Angelica reluctantly put Hoppy on the couch, giving him a kiss and telling him she'd be back soon. They went out the front door, Carol pulling it closed behind her, but not locking it. Nobody locked their doors in Frankfurt, not during the day when they were just in the yard. The front porch was small, but it got nice morning sun, and Carol had been meaning to sit out here more often, maybe have her coffee out here in the mornings. She settled into one of the 2 plastic chairs on the porch, white plastic worn and faded from years of sun. Angelica immediately went down the porch steps, all 3 of them, carefully holding onto the railing the way Carol had taught her. She was getting steadier on her feet, but she was still cautious, still took her time with steps and curbs and anything that required balance. She hit the bottom of the steps and took off running across the front yard, arms outstretched, head back, that pure joy of a child in motion. If you're still watching at this point, drop a comment with, "I'm still here." Let's see who's truly following this shocking story. Your dear Warren, engagement keeps these cold cases alive. Share this video, tag someone who needs to hear Angelica's story, and let's make sure this case doesn't stay cold forever. Carol watched her daughter run, smiling at her enthusiasm, at her energy. The grass was still a little wet from the morning dew, and Carol called out, "Be careful. Don't slip." Angelica waved at her mother and kept running, making a big circle around the front yard. The yard wasn't large, maybe 30 feet from the house to the street, maybe 40 feet wide. Typical for the neighborhood, enough space for a child to run, for a garden along the side, for a car to pull into the driveway. Carol sat back in her chair, letting her eyes close for just a moment, feeling the sun on her face. She'd been tired lately, more tired than usual. Probably just the normal exhaustion of raising a 3-year-old, but still, these quiet moments were precious. She could sit here and relax, while still keeping an eye on Angelica. Best of both worlds. She opened her eyes, checking on Angelica. Still running, still happy, still safe. There were no other children outside at the moment, which was unusual for a Sunday morning. Usually there were kids riding bikes, playing basketball in driveways, running through yards. But everyone must be at church, or sleeping in, or doing things inside. The street was quiet, peaceful. Carol thought about what to make for lunch. Maybe grilled cheese sandwiches. Angelica liked those. They had tomato soup in the pantry. That would be good with grilled cheese. Nice and simple. She'd wait until Michael got home, make lunch for all 3 of them together. Angelica was picking dandelions now, the yellow ones that dotted the yard. Carol needed to remind Michael to spray for those. They were taking over the lawn. But Angelica loved them, loved picking them and bringing them to Carol like they were precious flowers instead of weeds. Carol would put them in a little vase on the kitchen table, and Angelica would beam with pride at her beautiful flowers. A car drove by, slowly, some kind of dark sedan. Carol glanced at it but didn't pay much attention. She didn't recognize the car, but that didn't mean anything. Could be someone visiting a neighbor, could be someone lost, could be someone who lived a few streets over and was just driving through. This wasn't a through street, didn't get much traffic, but people did cut through sometimes to avoid the light on Main Street. The car disappeared down the street, turning left at the corner. Carol went back to watching Angelica, who was now sitting in the grass examining a dandelion very closely, probably looking at the fuzzy parts. She loved fuzzy things, loved touching them, loved blowing the seeds off dandelions and watching them float away on the breeze. Carol felt herself starting to doze off. The sun was warm. She was comfortable. The chair wasn't great, but it was good enough. She jerked herself awake, feeling guilty. She shouldn't fall, asleep out here while Angelica was playing. That wasn't safe. That wasn't responsible. She sat up straighter, rubbed her eyes, focused on her daughter. Angelica was standing now, walking toward the porch with a fistful of dandelions. She was saying something, talking in that stream of consciousness way toddlers do. Not really to Carol, but not to herself either. Just talking to talk. Carol smiled, held out her hand for the flowers. "Come here, baby. Show me what you picked." Angelica stopped halfway between the street and the porch. She was looking at something, her head turned toward the street. Carol followed her gaze but didn't see anything. "What are you looking at, honey?" Angelica didn't answer, just stood there looking. Carol felt a tiny flutter of unease, nothing she could explain, just mother's intuition maybe. She stood up from the chair, moved to the edge of the porch. "Angelica, come up here, please." And this is where the timeline gets fuzzy. This is where Carol's memory becomes unreliable, becomes fractured, becomes the kind of thing she'll replay in her mind for the rest of her life, wondering what she missed, what she didn't see, what she should have done differently. She thinks she looked away, just for a second, just for a moment. Maybe she looked back at the front door, wondering if she'd locked it, wondering if she should go inside and get a sweater because the breeze was picking up, and she was starting to feel a little chilled. Maybe she looked down at her hands, at the peeling paint on the porch railing, at nothing in particular. Maybe she closed her eyes again, just for a fraction of a second. That involuntary eye closing that happens when you're tired, and the sun is warm and you're comfortable. She doesn't remember. She'll tell police later that she thinks she looked away, but she's not sure. She was sitting on the porch, Angelica was in the yard, and then she looked up and Angelica wasn't there anymore. Just like that. There and then not there. Carol called her name. Angelica? That questioning tone, that slightly annoyed mother tone that expected a response. Maybe Angelica had run around the side of the house. She did that sometimes. Thought it was funny to hide from Mommy, to make Mommy come looking for her. No answer. Carol stood up, walked to the edge of the porch, looked left and right. Angelica? A little louder now, a little sharper. That edge of concern starting to creep into her voice. Still no answer. Carol went down the porch steps, into the front yard, looking around. The yard was empty. Completely empty. No 3-year-old with curly hair and pink ribbons. No pink leggings. No rainbow t-shirt. No little girl at all. She walked quickly to the side of the house, thinking Angelica must be there, must be hiding. Angelica, this isn't funny. Come out right now. That mom voice that meant business, that meant you're not in trouble yet, but you will be if you don't come out right now. Nothing. The side yard was empty, except for the garden. Tomato plants growing on their stakes. Pepper plants in neat rows. No place for a child to hide. Carol looked anyway. Looked behind the tomato plants like Angelica could somehow fit herself behind those thin stakes. She walked around to the backyard, her heart starting to pound now, that concern shifting into something sharper, something that tasted like fear. The chain-link fence formed a complete perimeter, 4 feet high, gate closed. Carol checked the gate, pulled on it to make sure it was latched. It was. Could Angelica have climbed over the fence? No, impossible. She was too small, too cautious. She'd never climbed anything higher than the couch in her entire life. Carol called again, louder this time, the fear now unmistakable in her voice. Angelica, her voice cracking on the second syllable. Angelica Marie Lewis, you come here right now. Using the full name, the way parents do when they're serious, when they need immediate compliance, when they're starting to panic. The backyard was empty. Completely empty. The swing set stood still. No child pumping their legs to go higher. The sandbox was untouched. The red plastic lid still covering it from last time they'd played. Everything exactly as it had been. Carol ran back to the front yard, her breath coming faster now, her mind starting to race through possibilities. Maybe Angelica had gone inside. Maybe she'd gone in the back door while Carol was checking the side yard. That had to be it. That was the only explanation that made sense. She ran up the porch steps, yanked open the front door, and rushed inside. Angelica! The house felt empty. That particular quality of silence that means no one else is there. But Carol called anyway, checking every room. The living room was empty. Hoppy still sitting on the couch where Angelica had left him. The kitchen was empty. The breakfast dishes still sitting in the drainer. Carol checked under the table anyway, that toddler hiding spot, even though she could see it was empty. She ran down the hallway, threw open Angelica's bedroom door. Empty. The bed neatly made from this morning, the stuffed animals arranged on the pillow, Big Bird poster smiling down from the wall. Carol checked under the bed anyway, checked the closet, calling her daughter's name over and over. Angelica. Where are you? Angelica, please answer, Mommy. The bathroom was empty. The master bedroom was empty. There was nowhere else to look. The house was small, just those few rooms, and Carol had checked all of them twice now. Angelica wasn't inside. Carol ran back outside, her mind no longer capable of rational thought, just pure panic now. Pure primal fear that every parent has nightmares about. She stood in the front yard and screamed her daughter's name. Angelica! So loud her throat hurt, so loud that neighbors started coming out of their houses, drawn by the sound of a mother's terror. Mrs. Patterson from next door came out first, still wearing her church dress. She was in her 60s, had lived on Riverview Lane since the houses were built, knew everyone, was the unofficial grandmother of the neighborhood. "Carol, what's wrong? What happened?" Carol couldn't form coherent words at first, could only point and gesture, and make sounds that weren't quite language. Finally, she managed, "Angelica. She's gone. She was right here, and now she's gone." Mrs. Patterson's face went pale. "What do you mean, gone? When did you last see her?" "Just now." Carol's voice was high and thin, on the edge of hysteria. "Just a few minutes ago. She was in the yard, and I looked away for just a second. And now? I can't find her." Other neighbors were coming out now. Mr. Henderson from across the street, retired Army, still got up at 0600 every morning. The Johnsons from 2 houses down, young couple with twin babies. The Martinellis from the corner, their teenage sons behind them looking confused and worried. Everyone spread out, everyone started searching, calling Angelica's name, looking in yards, behind bushes, under parked cars. The Martinelli boys ran up and down the street, checking between houses, looking in places a small child might hide or get trapped. Mrs. Patterson stayed with Carol, holding her arm, trying to keep her calm, though Carol was beyond calm now. "How long has it been?" Mr. Henderson asked, his voice steady. Military training kicking in even after 20 years of retirement. "We need to establish a timeline." Carol tried to think, but her brain wouldn't work properly. "I don't know. 5 minutes? 10? She was in the yard, and then she wasn't. Oh God, where is she? Where's my baby? Did you hear anything? See anything unusual?" Mr. Henderson was thinking abduction already, though he didn't say the word. Didn't want to plant that thought in Carol's mind if it wasn't already there. Carol shook her head. "No, nothing. She was playing, and I was sitting on the porch, and then she was gone. There was a car. A dark car drove by earlier, but I didn't think anything of it." "What kind of car?" "I don't know." Carol was crying now, tears streaming down her face, her whole body shaking. "A sedan, maybe? Dark blue or black? I don't know. I didn't really look at it." It's okay. Mr. Henderson put his hand on her shoulder. "We're going to find her. But we need to call the police right now." The word police seemed to jolt something in Carol's brain. Yes. Police. She should have called them already. Why hadn't she called them already? She ran back into the house, grabbed the phone from the kitchen wall, dialed 911 with shaking fingers. 911. "What's your emergency?" "My daughter is missing." Carol's voice was barely comprehensible through her sobs. "She's 3 years old, and she's missing. She was in our front yard, and now she's gone." "Okay, ma'am. I need you to stay calm. What's your address?" 1721. Riverview Lane. "Please, you have to help me. You have to find her. Officers are on their way, ma'am." "Can you tell me your daughter's name?" "Angelica. Angelica Lewis. She's 3 years old. She has dark curly hair with pink ribbons, and she's wearing pink leggings and a white shirt with a rainbow on it. Please, please, find her." The dispatcher kept Carol on the line, asking questions, keeping her talking. Standard procedure for missing child cases. The first few minutes are critical, the first hour even more so. The dispatcher was already entering information into the system, already sending alerts, already mobilizing resources. "When did you last see your daughter?" "Maybe 10 minutes ago." 15? Carol honestly didn't know. Time had fractured, become meaningless. How long had she sat on the porch? How long had she looked for Angelica before calling for help? It felt like no time at all, and like an eternity all at once. Was she alone in the yard? Yes. I was sitting on the porch watching her. She was picking flowers and playing, and then she was gone. Did she wander off on her own, or is it possible someone took her? And there it was. The question Carol hadn't wanted to ask herself, hadn't wanted to even think. Someone took her. Abduction. Kidnapping. All those words that happened to other people, that happened on the news, that didn't happen in Frankfurt, Kentucky on a Sunday afternoon. I don't know, Carol whispered. I don't know. Oh God, I don't know. The first police car arrived at 11:17, 6 minutes after Carol's call. Officer David Chen, 26 years old, 3 years on the Frankfurt police force. He'd taken the missing persons training, knew the statistics, knew that most missing children were found quickly and safely. Most were hiding somewhere obvious, or had wandered to a friend's house, or were with a non-custodial parent after a custody dispute. Most were fine, but some weren't. And something about Carol Lewis's face when she met him in the driveway, something about the terror in her eyes, made his stomach clench with dread. Mrs. Lewis, I'm Officer Chen. I need you to tell me exactly what happened. Carol tried to explain, tried to give him a coherent timeline, but everything kept coming out jumbled. Neighbors were still searching, still calling Angelica's name up and down the street. More police cars were arriving, officers spreading out, doing a systematic search of every yard, every bush, every possible hiding place. Michael pulled into the driveway at 11:23, getting home from the hardware store, seeing police cars and neighbors in his yard, and his wife crying hysterically. He knew before anyone said a word that something terrible had happened. He got out of his truck and ran to Carol, grabbed her shoulders. What happened? Where's Angelica? She's gone. Carol collapsed against him, her legs giving out. She's gone and I can't find her. For a moment, Michael just stood there, his brain unable to process what his wife was telling him. Gone. What did that mean? Gone. Gone where? How? Could she be gone? He'd only been gone for 30 minutes, maybe 45 minutes. He'd gone to the hardware store, he'd bought the parts for the faucet, he'd driven home. Normal things. Regular things. How could his daughter be gone? Officer Chen approached them, introduced himself, asked Michael the same questions he'd asked Carol. When did you last see your daughter? Did you notice anyone suspicious around your house? Has anyone been bothering you or your family? Any custody disputes? Any family members who might take her? Michael answered on autopilot. This morning at breakfast, no one suspicious, no disputes. No one would take her. Everyone loved Angelica. This didn't make sense. None of this made sense. More officers arrived. The watch commander, Lieutenant Sarah Morrison, took control of the scene. She'd been with Frankfurt PD for 15 years, had handled missing persons cases before, though never a child this young. She knew the first hour was critical. She knew statistics said if this was an abduction, they had hours at most to find Angelica alive. She didn't say this to the parents. She just started giving orders. Establish a perimeter. Search every house within a 3-block radius. Get a K-9 unit here now. Call in off-duty officers. Contact the state police. Alert nearby jurisdictions. Issue an Amber Alert. Wait, one of the younger officers said. Don't we need to confirm abduction before we issue an Amber Alert? Lieutenant Morrison fixed him with a hard stare. A 3-year-old child is missing from her front yard in broad daylight. She didn't wander off. She's too young. She's not with family. We've confirmed that. I'm not waiting until we find a body to call this what it is. Issue the alert now. The officer scrambled to comply. Within 20 minutes, an Amber Alert would go out across Kentucky and neighboring states. Every law enforcement officer, every news station, every electronic highway sign would display Angelica Lewis's description. 3 years old, dark curly hair, pink ribbons, pink leggings, white shirt with rainbow. Last seen Riverview Lane, Frankfurt, Kentucky. Lieutenant Morrison turned to Carol and Michael, who were clinging to each other in their driveway, surrounded by police and neighbors and chaos. Mr. and Mrs. Lewis, I need to ask you some difficult questions. I know this is hard, but we need this information to find your daughter. Anything, Michael said. Ask us anything. Have either of you noticed anyone watching your house? Anyone paying unusual attention to Angelica? Anyone who made you uncomfortable? They both shook their heads. No one. This is a quiet neighborhood. Everyone knows everyone. Any family members who might have taken her? Grandparents, aunts, uncles? My parents live in Florida, Carol said. Michael's parents are here in town, but they wouldn't take her without asking. They're probably at church right now. They don't even know she's missing yet. We'll need their contact. Information. Anyone else who has regular contact with Angelica? Babysitters? Daycare providers? She doesn't go to daycare, Carol said. She's with me all the time. There's no babysitter. Sometimes Mrs. Patterson watches her for an hour if I need to run errands, but that's it. Did Angelica ever try to run away? Ever wander off before? Never, Michael said firmly. She doesn't like being away from us. She's cautious. She wouldn't just wander into the street or go off on her own. Lieutenant Morrison nodded, making notes. She was thinking what she couldn't say yet. A 3-year-old child doesn't vanish into thin air. Someone took her. The question was, who, and how much of a head start did they have? The K-9 unit arrived at 11:40. 2 German shepherds trained for search and rescue. The handlers needed something with Angelica's scent. Carol ran inside and grabbed Hoppy, the stuffed bunny that Angelica had slept with every night for the past 2.5 years. The handler took it, let the dogs smell it, gave them the command to search. The dogs immediately went to the front yard, noses to the ground, following Angelica's scent trail. They circled the yard, went down to the street, and then did something that made everyone's heart sink. They lost the trail. Right there at the edge of the street, the trail just ended. Like Angelica had been picked up. Like she'd gotten into a vehicle. The handler confirmed what everyone was thinking. Her scent ends here. If she'd walked away on her own, the dogs would be able to follow her. This indicates she was likely picked up and put into a vehicle. Carol made a sound that wasn't quite human, a wail of pure anguish. Michael caught her before she collapsed, held her up, held her together even though he was falling apart himself inside. Lieutenant Morrison's face was grim. She keyed her radio. All units. We're looking for a vehicle. Dark sedan, possibly blue or black. Seen in the area around 1100 hours. That's our suspect vehicle until we know otherwise. Police were knocking on doors up and down the street now, asking everyone the same questions. Did you see anything? Did you hear anything? Did you see a dark sedan? Did you notice anyone who didn't belong? Most neighbors hadn't seen anything. They'd been inside at church, doing Sunday morning things. A few had seen the dark sedan driving slowly down the street. One neighbor, Mr. Bradley from 4 houses down, said he'd seen a car that matched that description drive by twice, once around 10:30 and again around 11. He'd noticed it because people don't usually drive that slowly, unless they're lost or looking for an address. Did you see the driver? No. Windows were tinted. Couldn't see inside. License plate? Didn't catch it. Sorry. I just noticed the car and then went back to what I was doing. The description was frustratingly vague. Dark sedan. Tinted windows. Could be any one of thousands of cars. Could be a Chevrolet or a Ford or a Toyota or a Honda. Could be blue or black or even dark green in certain light. Could be old or new. Without a license plate, without a more specific description, they were looking for a needle in a haystack. But it was something. It was a lead. And in a missing child case, any lead was better than no lead. By noon, Riverview Lane looked like something out of a crime drama. Police cars lined both sides of the street. Yellow crime scene tape marked off the Lewis's front yard. Television news vans were setting up at the end of the block, having heard the Amber Alert and rushed to the scene. Reporters were trying to get interviews with neighbors, with police, with anyone who would talk to them. A police helicopter circled overhead, thermal imaging cameras searching for any heat signature that might be a small child. The volunteer search and rescue team arrived from Lexington, 25 men and women trained in searching for missing persons. They spread out into the woods behind Riverview Lane, calling Angelica's name, looking for any sign of her. Even though the dogs had indicated she'd gotten into a vehicle, they had to search everywhere, had to eliminate possibilities, had to be thorough. Michael's parents arrived, having heard about Angelica on the news. They'd been at church, had come home to 6 missed calls on their answering machine, had turned on the television and seen their granddaughter's face on the screen. They drove to Riverview Lane in shock, unable to believe what was happening, unable to process that their beautiful granddaughter was missing. Michael's father, Thomas, was a stoic man, not given to displays of emotion. But when he got out of his car and saw the police cars and the crime scene tape and his son's face, he broke down. He wrapped Michael in a hug, and they both cried. 2 generations of fathers grieving for a little girl with curly hair and pink ribbons. Michael's mother, Dorothy, went immediately to Carol. She found her daughter-in-law sitting on the front porch, surrounded by police and neighbors, staring at nothing. Dorothy sat down beside her, took her hand, didn't say anything. What was there to say? Words felt useless, inadequate, empty. Carol turned to Dorothy and said, her voice barely above a whisper. I looked away. Just for a second. Just 1 second, and she was gone. This is my fault. I should have been watching her better. Dorothy squeezed her hand. No, this is not your fault. You did nothing wrong. Whoever took her, that's whose fault this is, not yours. But Carol couldn't accept that. Couldn't accept that she wasn't responsible. She was Angelica's mother. Her job was to protect her daughter, and she'd failed. She'd looked away for 1 second, and someone had stolen her child. The FBI arrived at 1:30. The Frankfurt Police Department didn't have the resources to handle a potential child abduction, and federal assistance was standard protocol for these cases. Special Agent Jennifer Roth, 32 years old, 10 years with the Bureau, specialized in crimes against children. She'd worked 23 missing child cases in her career. 19 had been recovered safely. 4 hadn't. She tried not to think about those 4 as she pulled up to Riverview Lane. She introduced herself to Lieutenant Morrison, got a briefing on what they knew so far, which wasn't much. Child missing for approximately 2 hours now. Possible vehicle involved. No witnesses to the actual abduction. No ransom demand. No obvious suspects. Agent Roth's face remained neutral, but inside she was worried. 2 hours was a long time in an abduction case. If this was a stranger abduction, statistics said that 80% of children who are killed are dead within 3 hours of being taken. They were already 2/3 of the way through that window. Every minute that passed decreased Angelica's chances of being found alive. She needed to interview the parents, needed to get every detail they could remember, no matter how insignificant it might seem. She found Carol and Michael still on the front porch, still surrounded by family and friends. She introduced herself, expressed her sympathy, explained that she needed to ask them some questions. Can we do this inside? Away from all these people? They went into the living room, Hoppy still sitting on the couch where Angelica had left him. Carol couldn't stop looking at the stuffed bunny, couldn't stop thinking about how Angelica had kissed him before going outside, how she'd promised she'd be back soon. Had that been the last time Carol would ever hear her daughter's voice? Agent Roth started with the basics: full names, dates of birth, Description of Angelica. Then she moved into more personal questions. Tell me about your marriage. Any problems? Any infidelity? Any financial issues? Michael bristled. What does that have to do with finding my daughter? Agent Roth's voice remained calm, professional. I need to understand your family dynamics. In many missing child cases, someone close to the family is involved. I'm not accusing anyone of anything. I'm just gathering information. Our marriage is fine, Carol said. We don't have problems. We don't fight. We're happy. Any issues with extended family? Anyone who might have a reason to take Angelica? No. Everyone loves her. There's no custody dispute, no angry relatives, nothing like that. Carol, I need to ask you about this morning. Walk me through it minute by minute. What time did Angelica wake up? What did she eat for breakfast? What was she wearing? What did she say? Every detail, no matter how small. Carol went through it all again. The same story she'd told 3 times already to 3 different police officers. The same timeline, the same details. Agent Roth listened carefully, making notes, looking for inconsistencies, looking for anything that might be important. You said you looked away for a second. Can you be more specific about that? What made you look away? Carol started crying again. I don't know. I don't remember. Maybe I closed my eyes. Maybe I looked at the door. I was tired, and it was warm, and I just looked away for a second. Just 1 second. Agent Roth nodded sympathetically but pressed on. Did you fall asleep? No, I don't think so. Maybe for just a second, but not really asleep, just closed my eyes. Could it have been longer than a second? I don't know. Carol was getting hysterical now. I don't know how long it was. It felt like a second, but maybe it was longer. Maybe I did doze off for a minute. Does it matter? Does any of this matter? Just find my daughter. I'm trying to do exactly that, Mrs. Lewis. I need to establish an accurate timeline so we know how much of a head start whoever took Angelica might have. The interview went on for another hour. Agent Roth asked about neighbors, about strangers Carol might have seen around the neighborhood, about any vehicles that seemed out of place, about anyone who had shown unusual interest in Angelica. She asked about Carol's daily routine, where she shopped, where she went, who she talked to. She asked if Carol had ever posted photos of Angelica online, on social media, anywhere someone could have seen them. Carol admitted she'd posted a few photos on Facebook, just pictures of Angelica playing, or on her birthday, or at Christmas. Nothing that seemed dangerous, just normal, proud parent posts. But now she wondered if someone had seen those photos, had learned where they lived, had targeted Angelica. Agent Roth then interviewed Michael separately, asking many of the same questions, looking for any discrepancies between his story and Carol's. There weren't any. Both parents told the same story, gave the same timeline, had the same lack of information about who might have taken their daughter. By late afternoon, the search had expanded to cover a 5-mile radius around Frankfurt. Police were checking every abandoned building, every wooded area, every place a child might be hidden. They were stopping cars that matched the description of the dark sedan, though there were so many that it was like trying to catch smoke. They were interviewing registered sex offenders in the area, though there were only 3 in all of Franklin County, and all 3 had solid alibis. The news coverage was constant. Every local station led with Angelica's disappearance. Her picture was everywhere. That sweet face with the gap-toothed smile and the pink ribbons in her dark curls. The same photo her parents had taken 3 weeks ago for her 3-year-old portraits at the JCPenney in Lexington. Neither Carol nor Michael could stand to look at it now. It hurt too much. A tip line was established. Hundreds of calls came in, 99% of them well-meaning people who thought they'd seen something but hadn't. A few were cranks, people who called in false sightings or claimed to have information they didn't have. Each tip had to be followed up, on, Each one had to be investigated, taking up time and resources. But you couldn't ignore any of them. Any one of them could be the call that broke the case. By evening, there was still no sign of Angelica. No body had been found, which was good. No credible sightings had been reported, which was bad. The trail was cold. Whoever had taken her had vanished completely, and they'd taken her with them. Carol and Michael sat in their living room, surrounded by family and friends, who didn't know what to say or do. The police presence on Riverview Lane had diminished as darkness fell, though patrol cars still drove by every 15 minutes. The news vans were still there, reporters doing stand-ups in front of the house, telling the story of the little girl who had vanished without a trace. Agent Roth came by around 8 o'clock to give them an update, which was really to tell them there was no update. They were still searching, still following leads, still doing everything they could. She couldn't tell them the truth, couldn't tell them that with each hour that passed, the likelihood of finding Angelica alive decreased exponentially. Carol asked the question she'd been afraid to ask all day. "Do you think she's still alive?" Agent Roth chose her words carefully. "We're treating this as a recovery mission until we have reason to believe otherwise. We're doing everything possible to find your daughter and bring her home." It wasn't an answer. Carol knew it wasn't an answer, but she couldn't push for more, couldn't bear to hear the truth if the truth was bad. Michael asked about taking a polygraph. He'd been thinking about it all afternoon, thinking about how police always suspect the parents first. He didn't want to waste time being investigated when they should be looking for whoever actually took Angelica. If taking a polygraph would eliminate him as a suspect, he'd do it right now. Agent Roth said they'd arrange that for tomorrow. Both parents would take polygraphs, standard procedure. She didn't tell them that the polygraphs were mostly to rule them out officially, that she'd already been evaluating them all day, and didn't think either was involved. Their grief was too real, too raw. You can fake a lot of things, but you can't fake that kind of pain. That first night was endless. Carol and Michael lay in their bed, neither sleeping, just staring at the ceiling and listening to the house. The sounds that were usually comforting, the creaks and sighs of their home, now felt ominous. Every sound made them hope irrationally that it was Angelica, that she'd somehow come home, that this nightmare would be over. But it was never Angelica. It was just an empty house, echoing with her absence. In the morning, day 2 of the investigation, Carol and Michael both took polygraph tests. Both passed. No deception indicated. They were officially eliminated as suspects, though their relief was minimal. Being cleared didn't bring Angelica home. The search expanded further. State police brought in additional resources. The National Center for Missing and Exploited Children got involved, printing flyers with Angelica's picture and distributing them to every truck stop, every rest area, every place someone might see them. Angelica's face was everywhere, but Angelica herself was nowhere. Investigators started looking deeper into the family's background, financial records, phone records, internet history. They interviewed Carol and Michael's friends, their co-workers, people they went to church with. They were looking for anything, any connection, any clue. They found nothing. The Lewises were exactly what they appeared to be, a normal, happy family who loved their daughter. The dark sedan became the focus of the investigation. Police reviewed traffic camera footage from the surrounding area. Though Frankfurt didn't have many traffic cameras in 1992, they found one grainy image of a dark sedan on Main Street around 11:15 that morning. But the resolution wasn't good enough to identify the make or model, and the license plate was impossible to read. They distributed the image anyway, asking the public for help. "Do you recognize this car? Were you driving this car that morning? Do you know anyone who owns a car like this?" The tip line exploded again with hundreds of calls, none of which led anywhere. By day 3, the urgency was fading. Not officially, Police were still working the case around the clock, but there was a shift in tone. Words like recovery instead of rescue started appearing in internal memos. The search area was expanded, but also deprioritized. They were still looking, but they were no longer expecting to find Angelica alive. Carol refused to accept this. She sat in Angelica's room, surrounded by her daughter's things, and refused to believe she was gone forever. She talked to Hoppy like Angelica might, telling the stuffed bunny that they'd find her soon, that she'd be home soon, that everything would be okay. Michael found her there, and his heart broke all over again. A week passed, then 2 weeks. The news coverage died down. Other stories replaced Angelica's. The police presence on Riverview Lane disappeared. Life went on for everyone except Carol and Michael, for whom time had stopped on May 3rd at approximately 11 o'clock in the morning. Lieutenant Morrison kept them updated regularly, though there was rarely anything new to report. They'd followed up on hundreds of tips, none of which panned out. They'd interviewed dozens of people, none of whom knew anything. They'd searched thousands of square miles, finding nothing. Angelica Lewis had simply vanished. The case went cold. Not officially, cold cases weren't really a term used back then the way they are now, but effectively. Active investigation wound down. The file stayed open, but nobody was working it full time anymore. There were other cases, other victims, other families needing help. The Warren Department only had so many resources. Carol and Michael tried to go on with their lives, but found it impossible. Their marriage, which had been strong, started showing cracks under the weight of grief and guilt and unanswered questions. Carol blamed herself for looking away. Michael blamed himself for not being there. They started sleeping in separate rooms because neither could stand to be touched. The house on Riverview Lane, which had been their dream home, became a tomb. They put it on the market 6 months after Angelica disappeared and moved across town, unable to live in the place where they'd lost her. The case generated several theories over the years, none proven, all speculation. The most popular theory was stranger abduction. Someone who had seen Angelica playing in the yard, saw an opportunity, and took it. This happened sometimes, opportunistic predators who snatched children when the chance presented itself. But those cases usually resulted in a body being found within days or weeks. Angelica's body was never found. Another theory suggested someone who knew the family, someone who had been watching them, who knew their routine, who knew when Michael would be at the hardware store and Carol would be tired and distracted on the porch. But investigators could never identify a suspect who fit this profile. Everyone they interviewed had alibis, or simply didn't seem capable of such a crime. A darker theory suggested Carol had fallen asleep on the porch for longer than she admitted, that Angelica had wandered into the street and been hit by a car, and that whoever hit her had panicked and hidden her body rather than face consequences. But this theory had holes. The K9 dogs would have found blood or evidence of trauma. The car would have left marks. Someone would have seen something. Some people, in the terrible way people do, blamed Carol. Said she was negligent for looking away. Said she must have fallen asleep. Said she was lying about the timeline. These people had never raised a child, had never experienced the exhaustion and the million tiny moments where you have to trust that everything will be okay, that the world will be kind, that your child will be safe for the 30 seconds it takes to close your eyes. Carol ignored these people as best she could, but their words still hurt, still made her question herself, still reinforced the guilt that was already consuming her. 5 years passed, then 10. Angelica would have been 8, then 13. Carol imagined what she'd look like, how she'd have grown, what she'd be interested in. Would she still love Big Bird? Would she have outgrown Hoppy? What would her voice sound like as she got older? Carol would never know. The police file on Angelica Lewis grew dusty. New detectives took over cold cases, reviewed the file, found nothing new to investigate. Agent Roth moved on to other cases, other missing children, though she never forgot Angelica. Years later, she'd tell colleagues that Angelica was one of the 4 that haunted her, one of the cases she wished she'd solved. Michael and Carol divorced after 12 years. The marriage couldn't survive the loss of their daughter. Too much pain, too much blame, too many memories. They remained friendly, still loved each other in a way, but couldn't be together. It hurt too much. Michael remarried eventually, had another daughter, tried to build a new life. Carol never remarried, never had other children. How could she? How could she bring another child into the world when she'd failed so completely to protect the first one? 20 years passed, then 25. The world changed. Technology advanced. DNA databases were created. Amber Alerts became standard. Security cameras became ubiquitous. If Angelica had disappeared in 2012 instead of 1992, things would have been different. But she didn't. She disappeared in an era when children still played unsupervised in front yards, when mothers still felt safe sitting on porches, when neighborhoods were still places where bad things didn't happen. In 2015, 23 years after Angelica's disappearance, cold case investigators decided to take another look at the file. New technology meant new possibilities. They re-interviewed witnesses who were still alive, reviewed old evidence with new eyes, ran old fingerprints and DNA samples through new databases. They found nothing. The case remained as cold as ever. They did create a forensic age progression image, showing what Angelica might look like at age 26. Dark, curly hair, now long instead of in ponytails with pink ribbons. The gap between her front teeth would be gone, either closed naturally or through orthodontics. The childish round face would be slimmer, more mature. But those brown eyes would be the same. The crescent moon birthmark would be the same. If she was out there somewhere, if she was alive, this is what she might look like. The image was distributed to media outlets, posted on the National Center for Missing and Exploited Children website, shared on social media. Thousands of people saw it. No one recognized the woman in the image, or if they did, they never called to say so. Now, 30 years later, in 2022, Angelica Lewis would be 33 years old. She'd be older than her mother was when she disappeared. She might have children of her own. She might be a doctor, or a teacher, or a mother, or a businesswoman, or anything at all. Or she might be dead, might have been dead for 30 years. Her body hidden somewhere, it will never be found. Carol Lewis is 58 now, still living in Frankfurt, though not on Riverview Lane. She keeps Angelica's room exactly as it was, has recreated it in every house she's lived in since that terrible day. The Big Bird poster, the worn stuffed animals, Hoppy sitting on the bed. She goes in there sometimes and just sits, remembering the sound of her daughter's laughter, the feel of those small arms around her neck, the weight of that little body in her lap. She never stopped believing Angelica was out there somewhere, never stopped hoping that one day the phone would ring and it would be her daughter, saying, "Mom, it's me. I'm alive. I'm coming home." It's the kind of hope that keeps you breathing, but also keeps you from ever fully healing. The kind of hope that's both a lifeline and a prison. Michael Lewis is 61 now. He remarried a woman named Susan, had a daughter named Emma, who's now 15. He loves Emma fiercely, watches her constantly, never lets her out of his sight. He's the overprotective dad, the one who drives his daughter crazy with his rules and his worry and his need to know where she is every single second. Emma doesn't understand why he's like this. She doesn't know about Angelica, doesn't know she had a sister who vanished before she was born. Michael can't talk about it. Even after all these years, he can't say the words out loud. The house on Riverview Lane has had 3 different families live in it since the Lewises left. None of them stayed long. There's something about the place, something heavy, something sad. The current owners, a young couple who bought it last year because it was cheap, don't know about its history. The realtor didn't tell them. You don't have to disclose that kind of thing in Kentucky unless someone died in the house. And as far as anyone knows, Angelica didn't die there. She just disappeared from the front yard. Sometimes the wife, Jessica, sits on that same front porch where Carol sat 30 years ago. She watches her own daughter play in the yard, a 4-year-old named Madison, with blonde hair and blue eyes, and a laugh that carries down the street. Jessica doesn't know that she's recreating the exact scene that preceded every parent's nightmare. She doesn't know that she's sitting in the same spot, watching her daughter play in the same yard, trusting in the same illusion of safety that Carol trusted in. The neighbors who lived on Riverview Lane in 1992 are mostly gone now. Mrs. Patterson died in 2005. Mr. Henderson moved to Arizona to be closer to his daughter in 2008. The Johnsons divorced and moved away. The Martinellis' teenage sons are middle-aged men now with children of their own, living in different states, occasionally thinking about the little girl who disappeared from their street when they were 16 years old. A few old-timers remain, people who've lived in Frankfurt their entire lives, who remember that day. They remember the police cars and the helicopters and the news cameras. They remember Carol Lewis's screams echoing down the street. They remember how it felt to realize that bad things could happen here, in their safe little town, to people just like them. They remember being afraid in a way they'd never been afraid before. The Frankfurt Police Department still has the file. It takes up 3 boxes now, 30 years of reports and interviews and tips and dead ends. Every few years someone pulls it out, looks through it, hopes to find something previous investigators missed. They never do. It's all there, every lead followed, every possibility explored, every stone turned over. And yet Angelica remains missing. The case is in the FBI database, in the National Crime Information Center, in the National Center for Missing and Exploited Children's Files. Her DNA is in CODIS, waiting for a match that may never come. Her fingerprints, taken from items in her room after she disappeared, are in AFIS. Her information is cross-referenced with unidentified remains found across the country. So far, no matches. There have been reported sightings over the years, of course. A woman in Texas who claimed to have repressed memories of being kidnapped as a child. A tip about a young woman in Oregon who had no memory of her early childhood. A DNA ancestry test that suggested someone might be related to the Lewis family. All of these were investigated. None panned out. The woman in Texas had been born in Texas, her birth certificate easily verified. The woman in Oregon had suffered a brain injury at age 5 that explained her memory loss, and her parents were alive and well, and very confused about why police were asking questions. The DNA match was a distant cousin, nothing to do with Angelica. In 2018, there was renewed interest in the case when a true crime podcast featured Angelica's story. The hosts did extensive research, interviewed Carol and Michael and former investigators, and presented several theories about what might have happened. The podcast was popular, reached millions of listeners, generated hundreds of new tips. Police followed up on every single one. None led anywhere. The most compelling theory the podcast presented was about a man named Robert Chambers, a maintenance worker who had done some repair work on Riverview Lane in the weeks before Angelica disappeared. He'd been working on storm drains, would have been in the neighborhood regularly, would have had opportunity to observe the families, to watch their routines. And he'd owned a dark blue sedan. Investigators tracked down Chambers, who was now in his 60s and living in Tennessee. They interviewed him extensively. He admitted he'd worked on Riverview Lane, admitted he'd owned a dark blue sedan, admitted he'd seen Angelica playing in various yards around the neighborhood. But he denied any involvement in her disappearance. He'd been working on the other side of town on May 3rd, he said. His work logs showed this. His supervisor confirmed it. He had an alibi. Still, investigators kept digging. They got a warrant for Chambers' property in Tennessee, brought in cadaver dogs, searched his house and garage and yard. They found nothing. No evidence linking him to Angelica. No indication he'd ever harmed a child. He was just a man who'd been in the wrong place at the wrong time, whose only crime was owning a car that happened to match a vague description. The podcast also raised questions about the timeline. Carol had said she looked away for just a second, but how long was it really? Could it have been longer? Could she have actually fallen asleep on the porch for 5 minutes, 10 minutes, long enough for Angelica to wander off on her own? And if so, where did she go? A 3-year-old can't cover much distance in 10 minutes. Every house, every yard, every street within walking distance had been searched multiple times. If Angelica had wandered off, she would have been found, unless she'd gotten into that storm drain that Robert Chambers had been working on, unless she'd fallen into the sewer system, been swept away by water. Her body carried miles from where she disappeared. It was a horrible theory to contemplate, but it was possible. Investigators checked the storm drains, sent camera equipment into the sewer system, followed every pipe and tunnel they could access. They found nothing. Another theory suggested that the dark sedan had been a decoy, that whoever took Angelica had been on foot, had grabbed her and carried her away through backyards and alleys, avoiding the street entirely. But the K9 dogs would have followed that trail, unless the person who took her had used something to mask her scent, pepper or ammonia or something else, which suggested premeditation, which brought them back to the theory of someone who had been watching the family. Some people suggested Angelica was still alive, had been taken by someone who wanted a child, who'd seen her playing and couldn't resist, that she'd been raised by another family, given another name, another life, that somewhere out there, a 33-year-old woman was living a normal life, completely unaware that she'd been stolen from her parents 3 decades ago. It was the most hopeful theory, the one that let people sleep at night. But it was also probably the least likely. In cases of stranger abduction, when a child is taken by someone with no connection to the family, the statistics are brutal. 74% of abducted children who are murdered are dead within 3 hours of being taken. 99% are dead within 24 hours. After 30 years, the likelihood that Angelica Lewis is alive is vanishingly small. But Carol refuses to accept the statistics. She runs a Facebook page dedicated to finding Angelica, posts regular updates, shares age progression photos, keeps the case in the public eye as much as she can. She's joined support groups for parents of missing children, has become an advocate for better Amber Alert systems, for more resources for missing persons cases, for laws that would help prevent what happened to her daughter from happening to anyone else. She's lobbied for changes in how law enforcement handles the first few hours of a missing child case. 1992. There was a waiting period before police would take a missing persons report seriously, a belief that children usually turned up on their own, that parents were overreacting. That's changed now, largely because of cases like Angelica's. Now police respond immediately. Now the first few minutes are treated as critical. Now Amber Alerts go out within minutes instead of hours. It's too late for Angelica, but Carol takes comfort in knowing that her daughter's case has helped other children, has helped other families, has changed the system for the better. It doesn't bring Angelica home, but it means something. It means her daughter's disappearance wasn't completely meaningless. The investigation officially remains open. The Frankfurt Police Department has a new detective assigned to cold cases now, a young woman named Detective Sarah Kim, who took the job specifically because she wants to solve old cases that others have given up on. She's been reviewing Angelica's file for the past 6 months, approaching it with fresh eyes and modern technology. She's been using new DNA analysis techniques, running samples through genealogy databases, trying to find connections that weren't possible 30 years ago. She's been reviewing the original police reports, with an eye toward what was missed, what wasn't followed up on properly, what assumptions were made that might have been wrong. She's identified several persons of interest who were never properly investigated in the original case. A plumber who'd done work at the Lewis house 2 weeks before Angelica disappeared. A delivery driver who regularly drove through the neighborhood. A man who'd been arrested for child molestation in a neighboring county just 3 months after Angelica went missing. All of these men had dark sedans. All of them had opportunity. None of them had been thoroughly investigated at the time. Detective Kim is working through them now, tracking them down, interviewing them if they're still alive, investigating their backgrounds and their movements on May 3, 1992. It's slow work, painstaking work, the kind of work that requires patience and persistence and a willingness to chase leads that will probably go nowhere. But she's determined. She's told Carol that she won't give up, that she'll keep working the case until she finds answers. Carol wants to believe her, wants to hope that maybe this time will be different, that maybe this young detective will see something everyone else missed. But Carol has been disappointed so many times before. Hope is hard after 30 years. There have been developments in similar cases that give some reason for hope. In recent years, several cold cases have been solved using new DNA techniques, particularly genetic genealogy. The Golden State Killer was caught this way. A child who'd been kidnapped in 1973 and raised by another family was identified through DNA in 2017. If Angelica's DNA could be matched to someone in a genealogy database, if her kidnappers had living relatives who'd submitted their DNA for ancestry testing, it might be possible to identify them. Detective Kim has submitted samples to multiple genetic genealogy companies, working with forensic genealogists to build family trees and identify potential suspects. It's a long shot, but it's something. And in a case this cold, any lead is worth pursuing. She's also been using new technology to enhance the old traffic camera footage of the dark sedan. Computer algorithms can now clean up grainy images, can enhance details that weren't visible to the naked eye. She's working with the FBI's forensic lab to see if they can get a license plate number, or at least a better view of the make and model of the car. And she's been going back through all the old tips, the hundreds of phone calls that came in 30 years ago, looking for patterns, looking for anything that might have been dismissed at the time but could be important now. It's tedious work, reading through decades-old handwritten notes, trying to decipher different officers' handwriting, trying to evaluate tips with no context about why they were dismissed. But she's found something interesting. 3 different people called in tips about a dark sedan that was seen not just on Riverview Lane, but in several neighborhoods around Frankfurt in the weeks before Angelica disappeared, always driving slowly, always during mid-morning hours when parents were out with their children. The tips had been noted, but never fully investigated, because there was no specific license plate, no specific description beyond dark sedan. Detective Kim is now looking at cases of suspicious vehicles in the area from April and May of 1992. She's trying to find a pattern, trying to figure out if someone had been cruising neighborhoods looking for an opportunity. If so, there might be other witnesses, other people who saw something and never reported it, because nothing actually happened in their neighborhood. She's canvassing old neighbors again, asking people to remember back 30 years, to think about whether they noticed anything unusual in the weeks before Angelica disappeared. Most people can't remember. 3 decades is a long time. But a few do. A woman who lived on the next street over remembers seeing a dark car drive by several times, always around 10 or 11 in the morning. She'd thought it was odd, but hadn't reported it because nothing happened. Now she wishes she had. Another neighbor remembers a man asking for directions around that time. He'd seemed lost, had been driving a dark sedan, had asked how to get to Main Street even though Main Street was clearly marked. The neighbor had given directions and the man had driven away. The neighbor remembers thinking the man seemed nervous, fidgety, like he was looking for something. But again, nothing happened, so it hadn't seemed important. These small details, these fragments of memory from 30 years ago, might be nothing. But they might be something. They might be pieces of a puzzle that no one realized was there. Detective Kim is gathering them all, building a timeline, trying to create a picture of who was in the area, what they were doing, whether any of it connects to Angelica's disappearance. She's also been looking at similar cases around the country. Were there other children who disappeared in similar circumstances? Other front yard abductions with no witnesses, no trace, no body ever found? If she can find a pattern, if she can link Angelica's case to others, it might help identify a serial predator who'd been moving from town to town. She's found several cases that share similarities. A 4-year-old boy who disappeared from his yard in Tennessee in 1989. A 5-year-old girl who vanished from a playground in Indiana in 1994. A 3-year-old boy who was taken from a park in Ohio in 1995. All during daylight hours. All with no witnesses. All with no bodies ever found. The cases were never linked before because they were in different states, handled by different jurisdictions, in an era before computerized databases made it easy to see connections. But now, looking at them together, Detective Kim sees similarities that are hard to ignore. All the children were between 3 and 5 years old. All had dark hair. All disappeared during a brief window when their parents weren't looking. All in small towns or suburban neighborhoods where people felt safe. Could these cases be connected? Could they all be victims of the same person? It's possible. Serial child predators do exist, and they do move from place to place, staying ahead of law enforcement, never staying in one area long enough to establish a pattern. If that's what happened, if Angelica was one victim among several, it might explain why the case was so impossible to solve. The perpetrator didn't live in Frankfurt, didn't have connections there, was just passing through when he saw an opportunity. Detective Kim has reached out to investigators in Tennessee, Indiana, and Ohio, sharing information, comparing notes, looking for connections. They're all interested, all willing to cooperate, all hoping that maybe this is the break that solves not just one case, but several. They're comparing DNA evidence, looking for matches, trying to build a profile of whoever might have committed these crimes. It's slow work. It's frustrating work. It's the kind of work that takes years and might never lead anywhere. But it's also the kind of work that sometimes, against all odds, results in answers. Sometimes the pieces finally come together. Sometimes justice happens decades late, but it still happens. Sometimes families get closure even when they've given up hope. Carol Lewis is cautiously optimistic about Detective Kim's work, though she's careful not to let herself hope too much. She's been through this before, has seen investigations ramp up and then fizzle out, has gotten excited about leads that went nowhere. She can't afford to get her hopes up anymore. It hurts too much when they're crushed again. But she cooperates fully with Detective Kim, answers all her questions, provides any information she has. She's given her DNA for comparison purposes. She's agreed to let Detective Kim review all her old records, her phone records from back then, her bank statements, anything that might possibly be relevant. She has nothing to hide and everything to gain if this investigation finally produces answers. Michael is less engaged. He's moved on with his life in a way Carol hasn't been able to. He doesn't want to think about Angelica anymore, doesn't want to relive that pain, doesn't want to let himself hope for answers that probably won't come. When Detective Kim contacted him, he was polite but distant. He answered her questions but made it clear he didn't want regular updates. It's too painful. He's built a wall around that part of his life, and he doesn't want to tear it down again. His current wife, Susan, knows about Angelica, but doesn't fully understand what it means to lose a child that way. She tries to be supportive, but she also wants Michael to let go, to focus on the family he has now instead of the daughter he lost. She doesn't say this out loud, but Michael can sense it. It creates tension between them, this shadow of a child Susan never met, but whose absence shapes Michael's entire approach to parenting. Emma, Michael's teenage daughter, has recently learned about Angelica. She found some old newspaper clippings her father had kept, articles about the disappearance, photos of the search efforts. When she asked about it, Michael finally told her the story, about her half-sister who disappeared before she was born, about the day that changed everything, about why he's so protective, so paranoid, so unable to let her out of his sight. Emma was shocked, heartbroken for the father she thought she knew, but realized she didn't really know at all. She understood suddenly why he was the way he was, why he had rules that seemed unreasonable, why he worried so much. She understood the fear that drove him, and she found herself wondering about the sister she never met, the little girl with curly hair and pink ribbons who would be 33 years old now if she was still alive. She asked if she could help with the investigation. Could she share Angelica's story on social media, create a TikTok about the case, use her generation's tools to bring new attention to a 30-year-old mystery? Michael's first instinct was to say no, to keep Emma away from this darkness. But then he reconsidered. Maybe a new generation looking at the case would see something others had missed. Maybe Emma's passion for justice could help where decades of professional investigation had failed. So Emma created a TikTok series about Angelica's disappearance. She researched the case thoroughly, interviewed her father and Carol, spoke with Detective Kim about what was known and what remained a mystery. Her videos were well-researched, respectful, focused on finding answers rather than sensationalizing tragedy. And they went viral. Millions of people saw Emma's videos. Millions of people learned about Angelica Lewis for the first time. The case gained traction online, was picked up by true crime communities on Reddit and Facebook, was discussed in forums and comment sections. Amateur sleuths started digging into the case, offering theories, finding old newspaper articles, connecting dots that professional investigators hadn't connected. Most of it was noise, people with no expertise making wild speculations. But buried in the noise were a few genuine insights. Someone found property records showing that Robert Chambers, the maintenance worker, had owned a second vehicle in addition to his dark blue sedan, a dark green Honda that could easily be mistaken for black or blue in certain light. This vehicle had never been investigated. Someone else found a court record showing that one of the men Detective Kim had identified as a person of interest had been questioned in connection with a child molestation case in 1991, a full year before Angelica disappeared. The case had been dropped due to lack of evidence, but it established a pattern of behavior that made him a much more credible suspect. A woman came forward saying she'd been a child living on Riverview Lane in 1992, and she remembered a man in a dark car asking her if she wanted candy. She'd said no and run home to tell her mother, but her mother had dismissed it as the girl being dramatic. The woman, now in her 40s, had never thought about it again until she saw Emma's videos. Could this have been the same person who took Angelica? Detective Kim followed up on all these leads. The second vehicle registered to Robert Chambers was interesting, but Chambers had sold it in 1991, a full year before Angelica disappeared. The new owner had no connection to Frankfurt, another dead end. The man with the prior child molestation investigation was more promising. His name was Dennis Crawford, and he'd been working as a delivery driver for a medical supply company in 1992. His route had included Frankfurt. He would have been in the area regularly. He owned a dark sedan, a 1987 Chevrolet Caprice, and he had no alibi for the morning of May 3rd, 1992. Detective Kim brought Crawford in for an interview. He was 62 now, looked older, was living in a trailer park outside of Lexington. He'd been arrested several more times over the years for various offenses, had done time for theft and assault, but nothing involving children since that dropped case in 1991. He seemed surprised to be questioned about a 30-year-old, missing child case. He denied ever being on Riverview Lane, denied knowing the Lewis family, denied having anything to do with Angelica's disappearance. But his denials seemed weak, rehearsed, like he'd been expecting this conversation for 3 decades. Detective Kim pressed him, showed him photos of Angelica, showed him maps of his delivery route that proved he'd been in the area. Still, he denied everything. She asked for a DNA sample. He refused, said she'd need a warrant. She got one. The DNA sample was processed, compared to DNA evidence from Angelica's case. There wasn't much DNA evidence, just some unidentified fingerprints from the Lewis's front porch railing and some hair fibers found on a fence post that might have been left by whoever took Angelica. The comparison came back negative. Dennis Crawford's DNA didn't match any of the evidence. Another dead end. But Detective Kim wasn't ready to give up on Crawford. DNA evidence not matching didn't mean he wasn't involved. It just meant he didn't leave DNA at the scene. She kept digging into his background, into his movements in 1992, into his history with children. And she found something. Crawford had a nephew who'd lived with him briefly in early 1992. The nephew, Tyler Crawford, would have been 19 years old at the time. Detective Kim tracked Tyler down, found him living in Ohio, working as a mechanic. She interviewed him about his uncle Dennis, about that period in early 1992. Tyler was reluctant to talk at first. There was clearly bad blood between him and his uncle. But when Detective Kim explained what she was investigating, Tyler's resistance crumbled. He told her that his uncle Dennis had been inappropriate with him when he was younger, had molested him repeatedly throughout his childhood. Tyler had never reported it, had tried to forget about it, had cut off all contact with Dennis as soon as he was old enough to do so. And then Tyler said something that made Detective Kim's blood run cold. He said that, in May of 1992, just days after Angelica disappeared, Dennis had suddenly told Tyler he needed to leave, needed to move out immediately. Dennis had seemed panicked, paranoid, had packed up Tyler's things and driven him to Ohio to stay with Tyler's mother. Tyler had thought it was strange, but had been relieved to get away from his uncle. Detective Kim asked if Tyler had ever seen his uncle with children, if Dennis had ever expressed interest in young kids. Tyler said yes. Dennis had always been weird around children, always watching them at parks or shopping malls, always making inappropriate comments. Tyler had known something was wrong with his uncle, but hadn't known how to articulate it, hadn't known who to tell. Did Dennis own a dark sedan in 1992? Yes, Tyler confirmed. A dark blue Chevrolet. Did he remember where Dennis was on May 3rd, that Sunday morning? Tyler thought about it, tried to remember back 3 decades. He thought Dennis had been home that morning, thought they'd both been watching TV, but he couldn't be sure. It was so long ago. Detective Kim now had a viable suspect. Dennis Crawford had means, motive, and opportunity. He'd been in the area, had the right kind of vehicle, had a history of inappropriate behavior with children, and had acted strangely in the days after Angelica disappeared. The DNA evidence didn't match, but that could be explained. Maybe he'd been careful, worn gloves, avoided leaving evidence. She got another warrant, this time to search Crawford's property. He was still living in that same trailer park, though in a different trailer. She brought a team, brought cadaver dogs, spent 2 days going through every inch of his current residence and the surrounding property. They found nothing related to Angelica, but they found other things. Computer hard drives containing child pornography, hundreds of images, some dating back decades. Photos of children in public places, taken without their knowledge or consent. A box of children's clothing, items that appeared to have been taken from various places, souvenirs of some kind. Crawford was arrested immediately for the child pornography. That alone would put him away for years. But Detective Kim wanted more. She wanted to tie him to Angelica. She kept investigating, kept digging, kept looking for the connection that would break the case open. She went back through Crawford's work records from 1992, mapping out exactly where he'd been and when. His delivery route for May 3rd showed he'd had deliveries scheduled in Frankfurt that morning. One was at a medical clinic just 4 blocks from Riverview Lane. The delivery was time-stamped at 10:45 a.m., 15 minutes before Angelica disappeared. Detective Kim felt the pieces clicking into place. Crawford had been in the area at exactly the right time. He could have made his delivery, driven through the neighborhood, seen Angelica playing in the yard, seen Carol sitting on the porch, looking like she might doze off. He could have circled the block, come back, waited for his moment. And when Carol looked away, when Angelica was alone in the yard for just those few seconds, he could have grabbed her. But proving it was another matter. Crawford wasn't talking, had lawyered up immediately after his arrest. Without a confession, without physical evidence linking him to Angelica, the case remained circumstantial. Strong circumstantial evidence, but not enough for a prosecution. Detective Kim needed something more. She needed Angelica's body, or she needed a witness, or she needed Crawford to confess. She focused on getting him to talk, worked with a forensic psychologist to develop an interview strategy. They offered him a deal, cooperation in the Angelica Lewis case, in exchange for a reduced sentence on the child pornography charges. Crawford considered it. His lawyer advised against it, but Crawford was old, was tired, was facing spending the rest of his life in prison anyway. And maybe, after 30 years, he wanted to finally tell the truth. Maybe carrying this secret had been a burden he was ready to put down. He agreed to talk. With his lawyer present, with everything being recorded, Dennis Crawford told Detective Kim what had happened on May 3rd, 1992. He'd been making his deliveries that morning, he said, had finished up in Frankfurt around 10:45, was heading back toward Lexington when he decided to drive through some neighborhoods, looking at children playing. He did this sometimes, he admitted. Not to take them, just to watch them. He knew it was wrong, but he couldn't help himself. He'd driven down Riverview Lane and seen Angelica playing in the yard, seen Carol on the porch, looking tired, looking like she might be dozing. He'd circled the block, come back, watched for a few more minutes. Carol's eyes were closed. Angelica was alone in the yard, picking flowers. He hadn't planned to take her, Crawford insisted. Hadn't planned anything. But the opportunity was there, and something in him just snapped. He pulled over, got out of his car, walked quickly across the yard. Angelica looked up at him, started to say something. He put his hand over her mouth, picked her up, carried her to his car. The whole thing took maybe 30 seconds. Carol never opened her eyes. Nobody saw. He drove away with Angelica in his front seat, her eyes wide with terror, tears streaming down her face, but unable to scream because his hand was still over her mouth. He drove for miles, out of Frankfurt, out into the country, down back roads where nobody would see. Angelica was crying, asking for her mommy, asking him to take her home. He told her to be quiet, told her it would be okay, told her lies he knew weren't true. He pulled off onto a dirt road, drove until he couldn't see the highway anymore, stopped the car, looked at this little girl who was terrified and crying and wanted her mother, and realized what he'd done, realized there was no way out of this. He couldn't take her back. He couldn't let her go. She could identify him. She could tell people what he looked like, what his car looked like. Detective Kim asked what happened next. Crawford's lawyer tried to stop him, but Crawford kept talking. Like once he'd started, he couldn't stop. Like the truth had been poisoning him for 30 years, and now it was finally coming out. He said he'd panicked, said he'd grabbed Angelica, had carried her into the woods off the dirt road. She was screaming now, fighting him, trying to get away. He'd tried to quiet her down, but she wouldn't stop screaming. And then he'd done something terrible. Something he couldn't take back. Something he'd regretted every day for 30 years. He'd killed her. He wouldn't say how exactly. His lawyer stopped him before he got to the details. But he admitted that Angelica Lewis had died. That day, died in the woods, somewhere off a dirt road in rural Franklin County. Her body was still there, he said. He'd buried her, not deep, just covered her with leaves and dirt. Had gone back once, years later, and found the spot. Found that animals had scattered some of her bones, but most of her was still there. He could show them where. He would show them where. That was his offer. A confession and the location of Angelica's body in exchange for taking the death penalty off the table. Detective Kim felt sick. She'd hoped against hope that Angelica might still be alive somewhere, might have been raised by someone else, might still come home someday. But deep down, she'd known. Statistics don't lie. Children who disappear in stranger abductions don't survive. Carol had been hoping for a miracle that was never going to happen. Detective Kim had to call Carol, had to tell her that they'd found who took Angelica, had to tell her that Angelica was dead, had been dead for 30 years, had to tell her that all the hoping, all the waiting, all the believing that her daughter might still be out there had been for nothing. Carol collapsed when she heard the news. Even though part of her had known, had accepted that Angelica was probably dead, hearing it confirmed was devastating. Her daughter was gone, had been gone all along. There would be no reunion, no miracle, no happy ending. But there would be answers. There would be closure. There would be a body to bury, a grave to visit. After 30 years of not knowing, Carol would finally know. Dennis Crawford led investigators to the site 3 days later. It was exactly where he said it would be, off a dirt road about 20 miles from Frankfurt, deep in the woods, where nobody ever went. The grave was shallow, overgrown, barely visible after 3 decades. But it was there. Forensic anthropologists carefully excavated the site, found small bones, scattered by animals over the years, but mostly still there. Found scraps of fabric, pink and white, the remnants of the leggings and shirt Angelica had been wearing that day. Found a tiny crescent moon-shaped birthmark, still visible on a piece of dried skin that had somehow survived. DNA testing confirmed what everyone already knew. The remains were Angelica Marie Lewis, 3 years old, missing since May 3rd, 1992. Finally found. Finally brought home. Dennis Crawford was charged with first-degree murder, kidnapping, and numerous counts of possession of child pornography. His confession meant there was no trial, just a sentencing hearing where he pleaded guilty to all charges. The death penalty was taken off the table as agreed, and Crawford was sentenced to life in prison without possibility of parole. He would die in prison, an old man paying for the terrible things he'd done. Carol Lewis was at the sentencing. She sat in the front row and stared at Dennis Crawford, this man who had destroyed her life, who had taken her daughter, who had let her hope for 30 years when there was no hope. She wanted to hate him, but found she didn't have the energy. She just felt empty. relieved to finally have answers, but empty where joy and hope used to be. She was allowed to give a victim impact statement. She stood up, her hands shaking, her voice barely above a whisper. She talked about Angelica, about the little girl who loved Big Bird and Peen. The Angelica Lewis case, a 30-year mystery, yut butter sandwiches, and her stuffed bunny hoppy. About the daughter who should have grown up, should have graduated high school, should have gone to college, should have gotten married, should have had children of her own. About 30 years of birthdays and Christmases and ordinary days that were stolen, not just from Angelica, but from everyone who loved her. She talked about the guilt she'd carried for 3 decades, the guilt of looking away for just a second, the guilt of not being able to protect her daughter, the guilt that had poisoned every moment of her life since that terrible Sunday morning. And then she looked directly at Dennis Crawford and said something that surprised everyone in the courtroom, including herself. "I forgive you." The words came out before she'd consciously decided to say them. But once they were out, she realized they were true. Not because Crawford deserved forgiveness, not because what he'd done was forgivable, but because carrying hatred for 30 years was just another burden, another weight, another thing that kept her trapped in that moment on the porch when her world fell apart. "I forgive you," she said again. "Not for you, for me. Because I need to let go of this anger so I can finally grieve properly. So I can finally say goodbye to my daughter." Crawford looked at her, tears streaming down his face, and nodded. It wasn't redemption. It wasn't absolution. It was just acknowledgement. Acknowledgement that he'd destroyed lives, including his own, on a sunny Sunday morning 30 years ago. Michael Lewis did not attend the sentencing. He told Detective Kim he couldn't bear to see the man who'd killed his daughter, couldn't bear to be in the same room with that kind of evil. He stayed home with his wife, Susan, and his daughter, Emma, processing the news in private, trying to find some way to move forward now that he finally knew the truth. Emma had taken the news hard. She'd been so hopeful that her TikTok videos would help find Angelica alive, would help reunite her father with his lost daughter. Learning that Angelica had been dead all along, that there was never any chance of a happy ending, had devastated her. But it had also galvanized her. She was studying criminal justice now, thinking about becoming a detective like Sarah Kim, wanting to help solve cold cases, wanting to bring other families the closure her father had finally received. The news of Crawford's arrest and confession made national headlines. Angelica's story, which had been largely forgotten, outside of Frankfurt, was suddenly everywhere again. True crime shows covered the case. Documentaries were made. Podcasts devoted multiple episodes to the investigation and the eventual breakthrough. The National Center for Missing and Exploited Children used Angelica's case as an example of why cold cases should never be abandoned, why new technology and persistent investigators can solve even the oldest mysteries. Detective Sarah Kim became something of a celebrity in law enforcement circles, was invited to speak at conferences about cold case investigation techniques, about the importance of reviewing old cases with new eyes and new tools. But none of that mattered to Carol Lewis. The publicity, the media attention, the recognition that her daughter's case had finally been solved, none of it brought Angelica back. 2 months after Crawford's confession, on a rainy Thursday afternoon, Angelica Marie Lewis was finally laid to rest. The funeral was held at First Baptist Church on Main Street, the same church where Carol and Michael had been married, the same church where Angelica had been baptized as an infant. The church was packed with people who remembered her, people who'd searched for her, people who'd never stopped hoping she'd be found. The tiny white casket sat at the front of the church, covered in pink roses and white lilies. Inside were Angelica's remains, what was left of her after 30 years. Carol had placed Hoppy, the worn gray stuffed bunny, in the casket with her daughter. Angelica would be buried with her best friend, the way she should have been sleeping with him every night for the past 30 years. The service was beautiful and heartbreaking. The pastor spoke about children and innocence and the terrible things that happen in a fallen world. He spoke about faith and hope and the promise of resurrection, of a day when families would be reunited and tears would be wiped away and death itself would die. Carol didn't know if she believed all that anymore. 30 years of unanswered prayers had shaken her faith to its foundations. But she wanted to believe it. She wanted to believe she'd see Angelica again someday, that her daughter was somewhere safe and whole and happy, that the little girl with the gap-toothed smile and the pink ribbons was waiting for her mother to come home. Michael attended the funeral with Susan and Emma. It was the first time he and Carol had been in the same room in years. They hugged, briefly, two people who'd once been in love, who'd once built a life together, who'd once believed in happy endings. They didn't talk much. What was there to say? They'd both loved Angelica. They'd both lost her. They'd both survived somehow, though neither felt like surviving was much of an accomplishment. After the service, the funeral procession drove to Sunset Cemetery on the edge of town. Angelica was buried in the children's section, under a large oak tree that would provide shade in summer. Carol had chosen a pink granite headstone with angels carved into the corners. The inscription read, Angelica Marie Lewis, February 14, 1989, May 3, 1992. Beloved daughter, forever 3 years old. Forever loved, forever missed. As they lowered the tiny casket into the ground, Carol thought about the last time she'd seen her daughter alive. Angelica standing in the front yard, holding dandelions, looking at something Carol couldn't see. That image had haunted Carol for 30 years. Now it would be replaced by this one, a pink granite headstone under an oak tree, marking the place where her daughter would finally rest. The grave was filled in. People placed flowers on the fresh dirt. Carol stood there long after everyone else had left, just staring at the headstone, trying to process that this was real, that it was finally over, that Angelica was home. Detective Kim approached her, put a gentle hand on her shoulder. I'm so sorry we couldn't bring her home to you alive. Carol shook her head. You brought her home. That's what matters. I can finally stop waiting. I can finally grieve properly. I can finally say goodbye. But even as she said it, Carol wasn't sure it was true. How do you say goodbye to a child? How do you let go of someone who was your entire world? How do you move forward when part of your heart is buried in a grave under an oak tree? She didn't know, but she would have to try. The aftermath. In the months and years following Crawford's arrest and Angelica's burial, life slowly returned to something resembling normal for the people who'd been touched by this tragedy. Carol Lewis sold her house and moved to a small apartment closer to the cemetery. She visited Angelica's grave every Sunday, brought fresh flowers, sat on the grass, and talked to her daughter about everything and nothing. She told Angelica about the weather, about what was happening in the news, about the memories she had of those 3 precious years they'd had together. She joined a support group for parents of murdered children, found comfort in talking with others who understood her pain in ways no one else could. She started volunteering at the National Center for Missing and Exploited Children, answering phones on the tip line, providing support to families of newly missing children, sharing her story when it might help someone else. She never remarried, never had other children. Angelica had been her only child and would remain her only child. Some people told her she should move on, should try again, should have the family she'd always wanted. But Carol couldn't imagine it. How could she love another child when loving Angelica had ended in such devastating loss? Michael Lewis remained with his wife, Susan, and daughter Emma. The resolution of Angelica's case had brought him some peace, some closure, but it had also reopened wounds he'd thought were scarred over. He found himself grieving all over again, mourning not just the daughter he'd lost, but the life they'd all lost, the future that had been stolen. He went to therapy, something he probably should have done 30 years earlier. He worked through his guilt, his anger, his fear. He tried to be a better father to Emma, tried to find a balance between protecting her and letting her live. It was hard. It would always be hard. But he was trying. Emma graduated high school and, true to her word, enrolled in college to study criminal justice. She wanted to be a detective, wanted to help solve cold cases, wanted to bring other families the answers her family had finally received. She visited Angelica's grave regularly, talking to the sister she'd never met, promising to honor her memory by helping others. Detective Sarah Kim continued working cold cases for the Frankfurt Police Department. Solving Angelica's case had been the highlight of her career, but it had also shown her how many other families were still waiting for answers, still hoping for resolution. She dedicated herself to working through the cold case files, one by one, bringing closure wherever she could. She stayed in touch with Carol, checking in regularly, making sure she was okay. They'd formed an unexpected friendship, these two women bound together by tragedy and determination. Carol sometimes joked that Sarah was the daughter she never got to raise, and Sarah didn't mind. She'd seen what losing a child did to a parent. If she could provide Carol with some comfort, some connection, some sense of purpose, she was honored to do so. Dennis Crawford died in prison in 2022, 2 years after his conviction. Heart attack, sudden and fatal. He was 64 years old. Carol was notified of his death, but felt nothing. No relief, no satisfaction, no closure. He'd been nothing to her, really, just the instrument of her suffering. His death changed nothing. The house on Riverview Lane continued to stand, different families moving in and out, none of them staying long. There was something about the place, something that felt heavy, something that made people uncomfortable even if they didn't know its history. The current owners eventually learned about what had happened there and put the house back on the market. Some places are too full of ghosts. The town of Frankfurt itself had changed since 1992. It was bigger now, more developed, less of a small town and more of a suburb. New neighborhoods had sprung up. The population had grown. The sense of safety that had defined the town in 1992 was gone, replaced by the same low-level anxiety that exists everywhere now. Parents didn't let their children play unsupervised in front yards anymore. Doors stayed locked. Security cameras watched from porches. The innocence was gone. But people still remembered Angelica. Every year on May 3rd, the anniversary of her disappearance, the local paper ran a story. Every February 14th, her birthday, Carol placed a memorial ad with Angelica's photo and a message. People who'd been children when Angelica disappeared were adults now with children of their own, and they told their kids about the little girl who vanished from her front yard, making sure the story was passed down, making sure Angelica wasn't forgotten. The case had lasting impacts beyond Frankfurt. The investigation techniques Detective Kim had used became textbook examples of how to work cold cases. The genealogy work, the social media engagement, the persistent review of old evidence, all of it was studied and replicated by other departments working other cases. Angelica's case also led to changes in how missing children cases were handled in Kentucky. The waiting period for reporting a missing child was eliminated completely. Amber Alert criteria were expanded. Resources for cold case investigations were increased. It wouldn't bring Angelica back, but it might save other children, might help other families avoid the 30 years of uncertainty that the Lewises had endured. Reflections on a cold case. The Angelica Lewis case represents both the worst and best of humanity. The worst in the form of Dennis Crawford, a predator who saw an opportunity and took it, who destroyed multiple lives for his own gratification, who let a family suffer in uncertainty for 30 years. The best in the form of everyone who never gave up looking for her. The police officers who worked the case, the volunteers who searched, the neighbors who never forgot, the detective who finally brought her home. It's a case that raises uncomfortable questions about safety and parenting and the world we live in. Carol Lewis did nothing wrong that Sunday morning. She was a good mother, an attentive mother, a mother who loved her daughter fiercely. She looked away for a second. Just a second. Every parent does this dozens of times a day. The fact that tragedy struck in that particular second, to that particular family, was pure chance. It could have been anyone. But it wasn't anyone. It was Angelica Marie Lewis, 3 years old, with curly dark hair and pink ribbons, and a smile that lit up rooms. It was Carol and Michael Lewis, a young couple who'd done everything right, who'd built a good life, who loved their daughter with everything they had. It was a family that happened to be in the wrong place at the wrong time, that happened to be seen by a predator who happened to be driving by, that happened to have their lives destroyed in the span of 30 seconds. The case also highlights the importance of never giving up on cold cases. For 30 years, it looked like Angelica's disappearance would never be solved. The trail was cold, the evidence was minimal, the witnesses had nothing to offer. It seemed like one of those cases that would remain a mystery forever, that would fade into history with so many other unsolved disappearances. But Detective Sarah Kim refused to give up. She brought new eyes and new technology to an old case. She followed up on leads that had been dismissed decades earlier. She connected dots that no one had connected before. And she brought Angelica home, not alive, which would have been the miracle everyone hoped for, but home nonetheless. Home to be buried, home to be mourned properly, home to give her family the closure they'd been seeking for 30 years. It wasn't the ending anyone wanted, but it was an ending. And sometimes, for families of missing persons, an ending is all they can hope for. What can we learn? If you're a parent watching this, the Angelica Lewis case is terrifying. It confirms your worst fears, that something terrible can happen in the span of a second, that you can't protect your children from everything, that the world contains predators who look for opportunities to harm the most vulnerable among us. But it's important not to let fear paralyze you or prevent your children from experiencing life. Carol Lewis did nothing wrong. You cannot watch your children every single second of every single day. You cannot prevent every possible tragedy. You can only do your best, stay vigilant, trust your instincts, and teach your children to be aware and cautious. What you can do is teach your children about stranger danger, but do so in an age-appropriate way that doesn't terrify them. Know where your children are at all times, and make sure they know to tell you if they're going somewhere. Build a support network in your neighborhood. Know your neighbors. Look out for each other's children. Trust your instincts. If something or someone feels wrong, it probably is report suspicious behavior to police, even if nothing has happened. The person you report might be the person who would have harmed a child if given the opportunity. Support organizations that work to find missing children and prevent child abduction. If your child does go missing, report it immediately. Don't wait. The first hours are critical. For true crime followers and amateur investigators, the Angelica Lewis case shows the value of keeping cases alive in the public consciousness. Emma Lewis's TikTok videos brought new attention to a 30-year-old case. That attention led to new tips. Those tips led to Detective Kim focusing on Dennis Crawford. The investigation ultimately led to solving the case. Your engagement matters. Your shares matter. Your comments matter. When you keep these stories alive, when you refuse to let cold cases fade into obscurity, you create pressure for them to be investigated. You generate tips. You keep victims' memories alive. You remind law enforcement and politicians that these cases matter, that families are still waiting for answers. But please, engage responsibly. Don't harass family members or suspects. Don't spread unverified information. Don't treat real tragedies as entertainment. These are real people who suffered real losses. Treat them with respect and dignity. Conclusion. Angelica Marie Lewis was 3 years old when she disappeared from her front yard on May 3, 1992. She was finally found and brought home 30 years later in 2022. The man who took her, Dennis Crawford, died in prison in 2024 after confessing to her murder. The case took 30 years to solve, but it was solved. Justice was delayed, but it eventually came. Angelica's family got answers, got closure, got the chance to finally say goodbye properly. It wasn't the ending anyone wanted, but it was an ending. Carol Lewis is still alive, still visits her daughter's grave every Sunday, still carries the grief of losing Angelica, but also the relief of finally knowing what happened to her. Michael Lewis is still alive, still struggling with the loss, but also grateful for the closure. Emma Lewis is pursuing her dream of becoming a detective, inspired by the sister she never met and the detective who brought her home. Detective Sarah Kim continues working cold cases, continues bringing families closure, continues proving that even the coldest cases can be solved with persistence and modern technology. And Angelica rests under an oak tree in Sunset Cemetery, forever 3 years old, forever loved, forever missed. Her story is tragic, but it's also a testament to the power of never giving up, of pursuing justice no matter how long it takes, of refusing to let victims be forgotten. If you made it to the end of this video, thank you for giving Angelica's story your time and attention. Thank you for refusing to let her become just another statistic, just another unsolved case. Stories like hers need to be told, need to be remembered, need to be shared. If you believe that cold cases matter, that every victim deserves justice no matter how long it takes, then please hit that like button, share this video, and subscribe to the channel. Turn on notifications so you never miss a case. And if you're aware of any cold cases that need attention, any families still waiting for answers, drop them in the comments below. Let's make sure no case stays cold forever. Thank you for watching. And remember, someone always knows something. Someone always saw something. The truth is out there, waiting to be found. We just have to keep looking. Rest in peace, Angelica Marie Lewis. You are not forgotten. This case, while fictional, represents the reality of thousands of families who've lost children to abduction and violence. If you or someone you know has information about a missing child, please contact the National Center for Missing and Exploited Children at 1-800-THE-LOST or your local law enforcement.